Hi and welcome to Photo IQ. I'm your instructor Gus Cantivero. This is Unit 11 for Camera Basics. We're going to discuss shooting in RAW format and how to process those files and how they differ from JPEGs. Let's get started. Okay, for new photographers, the concept of shooting in RAW files can be a little bit cumbersome, a little bit intimidating. You may not even know what that means, but that's okay. The RAW file format is taking the sensor data straight from the sensor and recording that information into a file format. Now, that is basically a non-image based format that can be interpreted to read the data as an image. So that's a little bit confusing, but I think everybody's familiar with the JPEG format. Everybody online knows that when you browse through websites and there's images on there, those are usually in the JPEG format. Sometimes when you take photos with your phone and you download them into your photo library, if you get info on them or you name them, you'll see that it says .jpg at the end of that file name. That is the image extension that is designated to show that that is a JPEG image format. JPEG is by far the most common format of images that's out there. The reason why it's popular is because it has a built-in compression system to be able to select how much compression and quality you would like to balance. A more highly compressed image is going to be throwing out a little bit of data information. It's going to be throwing out some sharpness. It's going to be throwing out a little bit of color information. And it's going to be able to compress that file down to a really small file size, which means that it's really good for image sharing online because it can download really fast. It means that you can text it to somebody. It means that you can upload it to social media really quickly. Now, there's a downside to it as well. If a file has been shared and compressed and copied way too many times, you will start to see a degradation of that image quality. You'll start to see a lot of jagged, blocky lines around the details. You'll start to see the colors get a little bit messy where they transition. So you'll see things that are sort of the classic example of a sunset or the sky, where you have a very, very soft and gradual fade of dark to light. Those are the areas where the computer is going to make a decision in order to throw some of the information out in order to save data, because there's a trade-off. We say that a lot here in Photo IQ, the trade-off. You have to give up something in order to gain something, giving up file size in order to gain speed. When you're talking about data and the amount of storage capacity that's required in order to save this information, it may not be the wisest decision in order to keep the maximum possible quality for every possible image that you take. When you take images with a phone, the phone is going to make a lot of decisions in what to keep and what to throw away. When you take a photo, and I mean throw away as in information in the image, not to throw away your photos. At least I hope not. That would be crazy. Could you imagine a time when we get to that point where the camera just says, that wasn't a very good photo. I don't think we need to keep this one. There is a lot of information that has to be traded off in order to maximize the capacity for storage. So when you are taking images with your camera and you have it set to JPEG mode, you have the option of whether you want it to be a small, medium, large, and sometimes the words are different. It'll say normal or regular or fine or extra fine. Those are words they vary amongst platforms. And sometimes next to those, you'll see that there is an estimate of either a megapixel count or a file size estimate that will be there. For example, on my Sony a7R II, when I have it in JPEG mode, it has a megapixel estimation next to it. So if I'm taking if I want to save data and I shoot a 42 megapixel JPEG, I'm still going to end up with something around, I don't know, maybe a 13 or 14 megabyte file as just a JPEG. If I'm trying to save space, that isn't really saving me a lot of space. That's still a large file for a JPEG. So you may want to shoot something that's more along the lines of a 12 or 14 megapixel JPEG. If you're just kind of out and about for the day and you're just shooting for fun and you don't really think that you're going to be printing these images large. Now, there may be a side of you that says, shoot everything in the maximum possible quality at all times because you never know when you might get a winner. That is a fine attitude to have as long as you can afford the data space for storing all of this stuff. It also means that maybe you want to be diligent about converting your images over to JPEGs when they really are just for fun, and then throwing out those RAW files. Then you are able to actually save some space and put those into, say, for example, your iPhoto library or whatever comparable image library that you use to store your photos. Now, speaking more strictly about what a RAW file is, we know that a JPEG is strictly an image file. When your camera shoots a JPEG file, it saves it to the memory card. You have that image file that can only be read and interpreted as an image file. It bakes in, as we say, it bakes in the details of what that color rendering is, what the sharpness is, what the saturation is, what the white balance is. You have some ability to alter it afterward in post, but you are limited because the camera has interpreted what it saw as such. So when you go and bring it into your image processing software and you say, I screwed up the white balance, it would look better warmer or cooler. What it's doing is manipulating with a non-reversible effect what it's seen. It's taken basically a piece of sculpted clay and it's now starting to twist it into a different shape. It's going to have a limit how much it can do. Versus a RAW file, if you think of that as basically just your clump of clay that's just wet and ready to be formed, all that is just data. It records that information to be interpreted later. So color information can be changed to make it warmer or cooler or more saturated, less saturated, without any negative effect. And you can do it over and over and over again without any kind of detrimental remnant left behind. When you affect a JPEG and you save that file, it then rebakes in that information. Every time you save the JPEG, there is some kind of alteration that's permanently rendered in that file. Whereas with a RAW file, you can always go back in and adjust it and reinterpret it. It's nothing more than numbers in an equation that get reapplied with variables. So if that's the way that your mind works, you can think of it that way and maybe that will help. Now again, with RAW files, there is some variability between the brands. I used to have a Canon DSLR that allowed me the option to shoot smaller RAW files. So I would still have the ability to shoot RAW, but it would be a smaller resolution. I've noticed that a lot of cameras don't have that option anymore, and I kind of wish that they still did, because in the age of these very high megapixel count cameras like the Sony a7R II that's 42 megapixels, I don't always want to shoot a 42 megapixel image of my friends or just hanging out or my friends' children or something like that. We don't want to always have a 42 megapixel file. Those images really add up the data very quickly, especially if you're using that camera not only for your fine art or something like that, but also just for fun. That's why they put the JPEG option in there, but I'm someone who does like to play with my RAW files afterward. I do like to process them so that they come out the way that I want them. It's just that I wish that we had some kind of a smaller option sometimes. 24 megapixels would be totally fine. But that's also why Sony makes the A7, which is 24 megapixels, and then they make the A7R, which is the high megapixel count camera, so you can choose which one you want. But we don't all have the money to be able to buy multiple cameras for different events. So if you're out there shopping, check and see if that camera that you're looking at has the option to shoot smaller RAW files. That's something you may actually utilize. So looking at this slide on screen, there are pros and there are cons. You'll see in this list that there's more cons than there are pros. However, the pro is a really big pro. RAW files are much larger in file size. They're going to fill up your memory card faster, they're going to fill up your computer faster. They're going to be large, which means that they're going to be slower to copy. They're also going to be slower to write to the memory card when you're shooting. So when you take an image of a RAW file on your camera, it's going to take just a little bit longer to record that data on the memory card. RAW files are going to have less compatibility. So if you're buying a brand new camera that just got released, a lot of the software out there may not support it yet. Sometimes it comes out very quickly if the software company and the camera company have a good working relationship. They'll communicate before releasing anything so that the day of the release of the camera, the software is already up to date. They've already pushed out an update to their users, and you can expect to use that camera the minute that you get it. There have been times where I've bought a brand new camera that was just released and I was not supported yet in the software that I like to use. I had to wait sometimes a week or even a month or more to be able to have access to the RAW files in the processing software. So the workaround there in between was that I would shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time so that the camera would record a RAW and a JPEG image, and then I would have my JPEG files so that I could immediately be able to look at them and play with them. And then when the RAW software updated its support, I was able to bring them in and then do my editing then. Another con on this list is reduced buffer. The data gets fed very, very quickly off of the sensor right to the buffer, and the buffer is a temporary storage space where the camera is able to read and interpret and process the data that's there. And then from there, it can offload it to the memory card as it processes. If it went straight from the camera to the memory card, it would be very difficult because it would just go straight to the writing process and it wouldn't be fast enough to keep up. The buffer is extremely fast. However, they vary in size from camera to camera. The buffer capacity is affected by the size of the file that it's being sent. So if you have a very high megapixel count camera, the buffer is going to need to be very large in order to keep up with the camera. Now the pro on this list is that there's an extremely large ability to edit your photos after you've taken them. It means that you can basically just leave your camera in auto white balance, and even if the camera totally screws up the white balance, you'll be able to correct it afterward. Even if you underexpose your image by 2, 3, or 4 stops, you can recover the data that's in the shadows. If you overexpose your image by a couple of stops, you'll be able to pull that exposure down and recover some of the highlights. It'll help you in really high contrast scenes where you have backlighting by the sun, or you have glint or glare that's coming off of metallic or glass surfaces in the scenes. It'll give you the ability to recover and push your images to 2 and 3 levels above what you saw with your naked eye. Now that's not to say that the JPEGs that the cameras shoot are not good. They are, they're excellent. You have the ability to apply film simulation modes or black and white or different kinds of fun effects that you can shoot in camera that might take a little extra time to produce afterward, and especially for sharing on social media, that is a great way to get that done. But if what you want to do is spend more time with your images to create your artwork from what you saw in your imagination, then RAW is what's going to be able to get you there. So as mentioned, RAW format files are files that need to be processed and interpreted so that the computer can read what they are, so that other programs can view them. You can't just take a RAW file and upload it to social media and expect it to work. It's a huge file. You're looking at 24 to 45, even 50 megabytes of a file. That's pretty big just to upload one file. That's not something you can upload to your greeting card website to have your Christmas cards printed. You have to process those files before you can share them. There are many software options available for you, and we're going to talk about a few of those here. First, let's talk about some of the free options. Every camera company offers some sort of free software processor to affect their RAW files. So if you have Canon or Nikon, Fuji, Sony, all of them, they all have some kind of free software download that you can get to load in your RAW files and then be able to export a shareable JPEG. All of the software will give you some form of ability to adjust your exposure, your contrast, your saturation, the white balance. It's going to give you those abilities. Some are a little bit more advanced than others, and some are a little bit more rudimentary, and usually all of them suffer in the user interface area. But they're free. So you really can't beat free. And free is something that is a great option to get you started if you're not really sure that this is for you. If shooting RAW or working with this kind of extra step to convert the files is worth it for you. Maybe you're a really high volume shooter. You're someone who when you go out, you shoot anywhere up to 100 photos, and you really just want to bring them home, download them, and then look at them in your library and share them. Shooting JPEG is a perfectly great option for you, and you should continue to do that. But I still want you to know how to do this so that when you're faced with one of those really difficult shooting scenarios, like being out in the desert, in the bright sunlight where you have an ultra high contrast situation, shooting in RAW is going to give you the ability to create a shareable file where previously it may have just been really unattractive with really, really deep shadows underneath and not being able to see the detail. If I do this and I shade my face from the studio light, if you can imagine the level of contrast from the high noon sun in the summertime, you're gonna need some ability to lift the shadows and drop your highlights, basically reduce your overall contrast, and able to create a usable image out of that. Another option for our Apple users is Apple Photos. Apple Photos has the ability to open RAW files, and there's a list on their website that shows what all of the supported RAW files are. Now, if you are using Fuji, you have to make sure that you select the uncompressed RAW file, otherwise it won't be compatible. Next, we have the Adobe option, which is extremely popular. However, it's not necessarily the best option, but it is a good option. And Adobe has gone to the Creative Cloud service, which is a monthly subscription. So it costs about $10 a month for the photography bundle, which will give you access to Photoshop and Lightroom, which is very usable and friendly software. It's pretty easy to learn, and Lightroom has a couple of flavors. There's the cloud version, and then there's the classic version, which I prefer. I don't like working with cloud software. So I do subscribe to the photography bundle, so I have access to Photoshop because I use it quite a lot for my retouching. I don't really like to use Lightroom. I did use it for many years, but it's kind of fallen out of favor with me recently. So that's about $10 a month, and that's a perpetual subscription which keeps your software up to date. Another option that you may want to look at is Capture One. And Capture One also has a subscription model of $8 a month, which is not very expensive. And they also give you an option to purchase of $109 outright to own the software. And that would be either for the Fuji exclusive software, which only handles Fuji RAW, and they also have a Sony version, which only handles Sony RAW. So if you're gonna buy one of those two cameras systems, and you may upgrade over time and stay with one brand sphere, then that may be a good option for you. It's not too expensive, and you don't have the burden of having to pay a monthly fee. They do have a more expensive version which works with all of the different camera brands, and that's the one that I use. If you do decide to purchase Capture One outright at $109 for the exclusive Fuji or Sony software, when you upgrade, it'll cost about $49. And as an example, let's jump into the RAW file converter for my Fujifilm files. You'll see it has all the controls over here on the right. And this is an image that I chose that's taken in the winter in a park that's near where I live. And it's a very high contrast scene. You can see that there's shadows in here and a pretty high key sky with reflective snow on the bottom. Over on the right hand side, you can see the controls where you have your exposure, and we can open it up, or you can drop it down. So if we go down -2 stops, you can see what it does to the snow, what it does to the sky. So if I zoom in, you can see snow down here, all the detail is maintained in these highlights. Let's zoom in a little bit more so we can get a little closer look. If we bring it back to our normal exposure, you can see how bright it is. It's bright white, and it looks like it's actually beginning to clip. Get very close to clipping anyway. And clipping means that it's off of the display gamut. It's too bright to display, so it becomes perfect white. Zoom in all the way to 100%. And let's compare this spot here to this shadow over here. So if I hold the mouse here, you can see over in the histogram over here, this shows you the relative brightness and darkness. So the dark is on the left side and the highlights are on the right side. So when I'm over here in my mouse cursor, it shows that the darkness is all the way down here. So it's in the bottom 10% of the exposure here and here. That's even darker. And then over here, this is all the way up at the top. So it's like the top 5% of exposure. So if I were to drop my exposure a full stop, let's say, and I bring my mouse cursor back, you can see the highlighted area, it's reduced the overall exposure. Now you can actually see the texture of the snow that's in there, whereas it was previously lost. And then if I come up here, it still has some information in here, but it's gotten very dark and it's very, very close to clipping. So likewise, if we go +1 stop, now you can see into the shadow and you can see the leaves that are in there. You can see the texture of the dirt. So it's actually recovered that detail without making it smudgy or losing any information. So it actually works pretty well. I want to show you the difference between RAW and JPEG so that when we jump into the software, you're going to be able to see how much more powerful RAW is. So one option that I mentioned before is shooting RAW plus JPEG so that your camera will record both a RAW and a processed JPEG so that you have the option afterward of choosing whether or not to process the RAW files or just chuck them because they're not necessary and the JPEGs actually look really good. So if you're shooting properly exposed and white balanced JPEGs, then most of the time your JPEGs are going to be more than adequate and you're not going to need any RAW files. So you're not going to have to mess with that. It's going to save you a little extra time and you can probably get away with the free software rather than spend the money. But since I'm someone who really likes to take my images to the next level, I typically process the majority of my images. So let's jump into another option for free RAW software, and that would be Apple Photos, which actually works really well and has kind of a nice interface. Now you'll see when we start to look at some of the close details, it doesn't work as well as Lightroom, Capture One, or Adobe Photoshop when looking at the fine details. So if we take this image, which is shot by my Sony a7R II, this is loaded into Apple Photos, and I just sort of did a quick sort of rough process based on loosely the way I had previously processed the image in Capture One. So you'll see over on the right hand side you have these very friendly looking sliders that are cool and easy to look at, and you just click and slide one way or the other. And you can pretty much get the idea of what the images do when you start to play with them. And because RAW has the ability to be reversible, you can always revert to the original and undo whatever you've done. I'm gonna reapply what I've done. So you can look at the black and white conversion, see what it does. There's a little undo button right here. Anything that you've done has a check mark next to it so that if you want to undo them just to see what you've done, it's that easy. There's also auto buttons that are right next to it so that you can let the computer decide how the color should be affected. There's little retouch tools for taking out spots on your images or on your sensor, or blemishes or red eye. And then here's your white balance, as I've mentioned. So you can make the image cooler or warmer. Now, usually you don't want to go so extreme. If you shot the image in the totally wrong white balance, sometimes you may need to go pretty dramatically in one way or the other. There's also going to be times when the camera completely misinterprets what it's looking at. Sometimes moonlight can do that. Sometimes you want the image to look like it was actually lit by the moon, and it will try to correct the color and make it a neutral gray, and that's not necessarily what was realistic. So in those times, you'll need to make those adjustments like that. Now I want to show you the difference in how powerful one software is compared to another. So if we go into Capture One, you can see the way that I originally processed this image. So I can jump back and forth. Now there's obviously a lot of color effects and work that I did in here to affect the color, where I have different things that I've done in order to apply different effects to it. So here's the original, and then here's what I've done to it. Now, one way that jumped out at me immediately when looking at these images is if we zoom into 100%, you can see how crisp and sharp the details are. If I go over to Apple Photos and I zoom in to 100%, right, that's hard to get exactly 100. There's 98. And we come up to the ridge, you can see that there's a pretty dramatic difference in the sharpness of the way it's rendering the images. So if we kind of look at this bush right here, if we put these right next to each other, so here's Apple Photos on this side, and here's Capture One on this side. So this is even with the sharpness turned up on the Photos version. So just because you have a raw processing software does not mean that one is equal to another. There is going to be a superior and a subpar version. Now the Apple Photos is still going to be a perfectly fine and fun option for processing your raw files, but I want you to see that there's a difference with the software that you pay for versus the software that's free. Next, we're still in Capture One, and I want you to look at the difference between the JPEG and the RAW. This is an image that I shot in both RAW and JPEG. You can see that both of them are beneath right there. So when you zoom in to 100%, there we are, and we zoom into here, these images look basically the same because we haven't done anything yet. So the RAW file has a little bit less sharpness applied to it, and as I had mentioned, the camera does a little bit of interpretation when it's writing the JPEG file. And I can kind of decide how much sharpening I want applied, or how much saturation I want applied, or how much film simulation, or whatever I want. I can decide that stuff in the camera's menu before it writes anything. So here, this is actually a good example because it's against the sky. So you can see that this is a little bit softer than this one over here. Remember, the left is the JPEG. Now, if we start to push these images, if we start to say we want to do some dramatic effects to the exposure and to the contrast, let's say we want to open up our exposure by a full stop. Look what's going on in the sky here. There's only so much that it can do before it starts to fall apart. So let's look in the shadow areas because that will be the most obvious. So let's look down here. Let's go to 2 stops. Let's go further. Let's go all the way. Look what it does in the shadow area. That does not look attractive. All right, so 4 stops is very dramatic. You wouldn't ever do that. At least you probably shouldn't, because your image shouldn't be that badly exposed. But look what the shadow area here versus here. This looks really weird. This, it doesn't look amazing because it's been poorly exposed and pushed, but you can still see the detail and all the shadows, and it doesn't look like sandpaper over here. I don't even know what I'm looking at. Here I can identify what I'm looking at. Likewise, if we go the other way, let's drop that 4 stops. Let's drop that 4 stops. So here's the 2 exact same spots in these images. And the image on the right is the RAW file that's been dropped 4 stops. Again, very dramatic. You shouldn't be needing to push your images that far, but nevertheless, we're doing it here as an example of what the difference is. When we drop the RAW file by 4 stops, you can still see detail in the highlights and the shadows, whereas in the JPEG, it just, I don't know what it does. There's no contrast left. It just doesn't know what to do with it because the information is hard baked in. So it's not able to reinterpret it. It's only able to try to reform something that's already been created. So if we come back to a more normal, let's say minus a half stop, and then we come back to this one and we do minus 0.5, they're still not, they're not bad, but you can still see that there's a flatness right here on this ridge, whereas this one actually has some ability. So if we reduce our contrast like that, and then we try to do a little highlight recovery, pull that up, look what it's done now. Now it actually has like a fall off, all right? It's like a gradation that happens from the highlight down to the shadow area. Whereas if we do that on this one, let's do the highlight recovery and let's reduce the contrast. What was the number? Yeah, it's about the same. It's minus 24. I hope that you can see the difference here that it's coming across. There's a pretty massive difference in the harshness of what it does to highlights. When you try to reduce highlights in a JPEG, all it basically does is drop the tone, but it doesn't recover data, it doesn't recover information. So if you look at this one, this image has not had any sharpening applied to it. So if we come over to here and we add some sharpening, and this sharpening you need to play with, you need to get it exactly correct because it can go awry pretty quickly. So if we do that, now we're kind of like apples to apples with the amount of crispness that we're talking, and you can see how on this block here in particular, right here and right here, there's no tone. There's no detail. All it is tone. All it's done is taken a spot that was white and then dropped it from perfect white, and then dropped it 30 or 40% down to a middle gray. So now both of these images have basically the same effects applied, but when we look at this one full screen, it looks really nice versus this one, which has had like a yellowing and sort of a cast applied to it. Now let's also look at color data that gets maintained. So we're going to go over to our color panel here, and we have our white balance. So if we drop this down to 2050, we do the same thing on this one. So these both have the same white balance correction applied to them. However, the RAW file actually kind of looks like a shot that was taken at night under moonlight, whereas this shot is just a cooler version and the magenta is starting to come out. So it's not actually allowing us to do the same kind of white balance effect that you otherwise would be able to do just by using the white balance, the color temperature slider. So I hope that this illustrates how much more powerful this raw processing software is. And when you jump all the way in here, the file hasn't fallen apart. It hasn't gotten ugly and unusable. Whereas this one, which has had a lot done to it, it lacks something. the detail and the highlights is gone, and the shadows are mucky. So I hope that this is illustrative as to how powerful RAW is. And now here's Lightroom so that you can take a look at what these look like. And again, here's the JPEG and here is the RAW file. Now Capture One works in sort of an all-in-one workspace where you have access to your modules on the upper left corner. Now Lightroom is a little bit different, where its modules are divided by what you would like to do. If you're in your library module, it means that you're in the organizational mode. If you go into your develop module, then it means that you're going to get access to all of the tools that are here. And these are divided. You have all of your basic image tools all in one long row. So instead of them being divided by organization, they're all just in one long scroll panel. So you have your white balance just the same as before. Warm it up, you make it look like it's got some nice sunset light on there. Drop your exposure a little bit. Let's see how that looks. I don't know which way. Oh, there you go. That looks cool. A little high contrast. This works a little bit opposite to Capture One, where the highlight recovery tool and the shadows are all the way on the left, and then you just slide them to the right to recover. This one actually is, you can drop them or lift them based on what you want, and everything is positioned at 0. So it's not necessarily apples to apples, one to the other. There's a difference in the way that they operate. There are some things that Lightroom is better at than Capture One, and I think Capture One is better at dealing with fine color. But that is going to be up to you to decide which one you like. And I think both software has a 1-month free trial, so that you're going to be able to get in there and take a look to see which one you like better. So, I mean, just from using the basic sliders here, that actually looks pretty cool, right? That actually is, it looks like a nice, like a sunset shot with a really nice warm light that's about to go over the horizon, and it's really warming up the scene. Looks very dramatic, even though it's a really ugly, muddy path here. This is not exactly like an amazing photo, but I do think that it served as a great example for what we're talking about because of the contrast of the scene. And then the last example I'm going to show is using Camera Raw within Photoshop. If you just open up your RAW file right into Photoshop, it's going to open up in this dialog. And it does look similar with some of the same words as Lightroom, but Lightroom is going to give you the organizational tools as well, so that you can create a library and start adding the images to that library over time. Photoshop's Camera Raw is only going to allow you to edit that photo. Okay, so really quick, we just did the same thing that we just did a moment ago in Lightroom. And then we go and either open the image into Photoshop so we can do retouching, or we hit Save Image over here so we can save it out as a JPEG and then go ahead and share it. Okay, that's gonna do it for Unit 11 of Camera Basics, where we talked all about how to process your RAW files and how different they are from JPEGs. Get out there and check out the different software and see which one works best for you. Until next time, keep shooting.